you. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you all?
Good.
Alive.
Yes. Yes, you are. And this is our second in a series of 2 funeral planning seminars sponsored by the Charitable Foundation for St. Peter's Church. Thank you to the foundation for putting this on and for supporting St. Peter's present and future ministry. I always say that annual giving is for this year and foundation giving is for 40 years from now. And so the foundation is laying the framework for us to be continuing to do ministry together years after all of us have gone and our descendants are here continuing to serve, which is why they sponsor such workshops as estate planning, funeral planning, so that we can be making those future plans together. So thank you to the foundation. Some of you were here last week and some of you were not, and that's okay. Today we're going to be workshopping, so I'm not going to talk a lot from the front today. This is your opportunity for us to dig into that form together, for me to circulate around the room and be answering questions as they come up on that form. Last week we did the framework. Last week we did things like, what is a funeral? Why is it important? All those sorts of questions. If you want to see that workshop from last week, to go back and get the basis for the work that we're doing today, you can go find our YouTube channel, St. Peter's Parish Fernandina, and that video is on our YouTube channel. Rachel Davis, our Director of Adult Formation and Parish Engagement, is going to be good enough to send all of you who are here a direct link to that video. So if you need to see it or want to refresh yourself, even if you were here last week, if we have your email address in Realm, our database, you'll get an email from Rachel later with a direct link to that video from last week. If you don't know that we have your email address in Realm, Rachel would be glad to look at that for you and to be sure that we have updated contact information for you. Okay? So as we begin, I am going to field any general questions from the front. That's how we're going to start today. Any questions that have arisen as you thought about last week, if you were here last week, or general questions about funeral planning as you've begun to think about this seminar. So if it's good for the whole group, go ahead and ask it now if it's in your head. Otherwise, I'm going to circulate to answer detailed questions. During the time, if I hear a general question come up that would be good for the whole group to hear, I may walk up here, turn the microphone on, and answer the question for the whole group. Does that make sense?
Good.
So let me give you an example of the kind of question I would like to answer during this time. Okay? I mentioned last week that a funeral is an occasion to preach the gospel as well as to talk about the life of the loved one who has departed, who we are celebrating at the funeral. And so the question that naturally arises out of that is sometimes in lots of religious traditions you have what's called a eulogy, right? It's an opportunity for a family member or a friend or some combination of those to get up and say something particularly about the life of their loved one. In our tradition, we don't make provision for eulogies. So we don't have eulogies in a funeral sermon. You won't find that word in the prayer book, right? You'll never find the word eulogy. What we do make provision for, particularly at St. Peter's, is for what we call words of remembrance. So this is a time for a family member or a friend who presumably knows you pretty well to get up and say a few words about your life, remembering that it's in the context of a church service, remembering that it needs to be brief, because at the end of it, I or my designee or whichever member of the clergy we've invited is going to preach a sermon in your funeral, and it'll talk about your life and bring in together with the gospel. One of the ways in which words of so let me ask the question then. The question would be, should I have words of remembrance at my funeral, right? Is that something I want to do? And the answer is maybe. Maybe. There are particular circumstances where I find it really, really helpful to have a family member who has been briefed that this is a church service and that it needs to be fairly brief, but who has had a chance to think about your life and be able to reflect back a few stories in the liturgy. One of the situations in which that is really helpful is during clergy transitions, right? So I've been the rector of St. Peter's for, 19 months now. And so if you're sitting in this room, I know who you are, right? Around to be sure, yes? I know who you are. I know something about you. We may still be getting to know each other, but it's not the case that I've just come to town and I'm going to wind up taking a funeral for somebody that I had never met, which happens, right? In our tradition, clergy transition means that the rector of St. Peter's may not be the same person who was here when you did your funeral plan. In that circumstance, I do tend to find it helpful to work with a family member who can say some things about that family member who has died that ring truer than me standing up and saying, well, I never knew so-and-so, but I hear that they were really good at golf, right? So maybe. The other side of the question is, do you have a family member or a friend who can do that work at an emotionally taxing time? That's an open question. You may have somebody who has spoken at every family funeral that you've ever had since you were born, right? And that's what they do. Like they need that 2 minutes because they're going to honor the family tradition of speaking about your life for 2 minutes. You may not have anybody like that. And so the answer to the question is maybe. And that's one of the things we want to work on today. Okay? That's the kind of question I would answer generally. Are there any questions that have arisen for you all in your thinking or getting ready for today, or reflecting on last week? Anything like that that you want to ask for the good of the order? And then otherwise, we're going to tuck into this form.
Just a quick comment. Something David and I were talking about. He said, well, I want it to be things that'll make you feel better. And I'm like, well, that's great, but I want it to be things that you thought were important too. So I'd say that balance might be something to think about as well.
I think that's right. I think that's right. You'll often hear people say funerals are for the living, right? That's a pretty common expression. And there's an element of that that's true, certainly. And I would argue that because of our lively resurrection faith, funerals are also for the dead, because we believe that the dead are alive in Christ. And so there's a sense in which part of this plan, when you have the chance to reflect with family members and friends who may be a part of this end-of-life process, you may make a plan because this is what you want, and then you hear from all your family that, when I think about your life, I think about X. So you may change the plan, which lends itself to another question we may ask for the good of the order, which is, how often can I change my funeral plan? Right? And the answer is, as many times as you want. We'll have something on file for you if you submit this form. And if you get it on file and then go to church Sunday, and Tim, Director of Music Ministries, Tim McKee, who's standing over there in the corner, plays and the choir sings a hymn that you've never heard before, but it's the most beautiful lyrical expression of the gospel that you've ever heard, then call the office Monday morning and we'll put that hymn in your funeral plan. So you may change it as many times as you want. Perhaps another general question would be, how soon should I have my funeral plan on file? And the answer is, it's never too early. That's the answer. I told you last week, Carly Woodfin and I have had funeral plans since we were 24. So when you have even a draft plan, even if you're not sure about something, it's fine for you to put it on file and say, I'm still thinking about this, and I'll let you know. And then we have something on file. What else?
Question. I did watch it on YouTube. Last week you were going over more of the financial side or the estate issues.
Megan Allen, I think
Megan
that was
Allen.
Megan Allen who did that. That's right. So there is another video on our YouTube channel from about 6 weeks ago, I think it was, when the foundation sponsored Megan, who's an estate planning attorney, to come and talk about end-of-life documents. So 6 documents you need when you're doing estate planning. That video is available for review and could also refer questions to Megan about that, because I am not an expert in tax law or estate planning. I'm an expert in funeral planning.
If you'd like a copy of the worksheet from her lesson presentation, I can bring those over today if that would be helpful. It's just a quick raise of hands. Okay, I'll make some copies and bring them over.
Great.
Thank you.
Good question.
And would you mind also putting those on the website so that they?
What else for the good of the group?
Are you gonna walk through a little bit of the form and what should go into it?
I'm going to do that as I walk around. Yeah. So if you want to take that form out, because our next step after we finish general questions is we're going to start making notes.
Yes.
So in your folder, you have that funeral planning form. Lee, will you hold up that form?
Please hold.
It's a 4-page form, a folder, so it opens like that. It's 4 pages folded from an 11 by 17 sheet. On the front of that form is what we used to call the customary for burial. It was a brochure that was distributed in past versions of this packet, but it lays out some things that are just helpful for you to know. Flowers, how do we handle flowers? Music, how do we handle music? That sort of thing. Page 2 is where you're going to enter your individual choices. You've thought about readings, you've thought about hymns, personnel, and so forth. Okay? Page 3 is notes. That's both for me and for you. You can put notes in there of things that you particularly want us to remember in the office. I will often use that when I sit down with family and am pulling out a funeral plan, and I'll say, tell me about so-and-so. And then I'll just make some notes as we're going along, because remember, I'm getting ready to preach a homily, or somebody is, as we move toward a funeral. And then page 4 is a fee worksheet. So you can read through the specific details about what goes into our standard funeral fees and then our optional funeral fees based on the selections that you make.
This mentions there's a list of
Yes.
So I was gonna ask.
They're in the folder, yeah.
It's on a separate sheet in the folder. If those folders were pre-made before last week,
Some of the folders may be missing that worksheet, so I'll come around with extras of those.
Rachel's got extra
Sorry about that.
extra copies of that suggested hymn sheet. All right.
Oh, Joe, something else though, thinking, we have on the customary, traditional, and contemporary language.
Yes. Great
So-
question.
So, again, in our house, David put traditional,
Uh-huh.
and I said, but you realize when we have communion, we use right to, so that's technically more contemporary language. He said, no, I didn't understand that. I just wanna make sure we use the language that has all the angels and archangels and all the company. I'm like, we got it, but
Yes.
I think there may be some confusion about that, if you.
Yes. Traditional and contemporary language equals right one or right two in this funeral plan. You'll often see parishes, and I tend to do this as well, call right one a traditional language liturgy, simply because for folks who are new, right one is absolutely meaningless. If you don't know the prayer book, like what in the world does right two mean, right? So that's why the traditional versus contemporary language is in that funeral plan. Traditional is what we call right one. So this is these, thous. It is, as it turns out, a liturgy that a little more closely matches the 1928 Book of Common Prayer.
Very closely matched.
Uh-huh. Whereas the right to the contemporary language liturgy is a pretty substantial rewrite of the more traditional Anglican burial liturgy. So if you circle contemporary, we're going to use right to. including a rite to Eucharistic prayer. And if you circle traditional, we're gonna use rite 1.
And it may be also that people want to know which Eucharistic prayer form, in case they have a particular favorite.
That's right. That's right. And rather than make this form so detailed that people gave up and got discouraged, that's something
Right.
that we would include in the notes.
Right.
So as I'm walking around and you say, I love prayer C more than anything else in the prayer book, and
Anything else in the prayer book?
we're gonna scratch that into the notes. So that when Patty's making a bulletin one of these days, or her designee, we'll have that to hand and put it in the bulletin. Great question. Yeah, Tom?
In the former form that was used in the seminar that we had last year.
Yes.
There was references to, be cremated or other things like that. And that's, just put that kind of thing in the notes instead, or do you care to have that information?
Well, there's a place
Okay.
for ashes.
Yes.
Okay.
That's where we've asked for, this is a substantial rewrite of our previous funeral planning form, including taking all the kind of back office stuff out of that form so that you don't have to try to figure out whether you should check, I've contacted the altar guild, like what, that was not necessary for you all. So the way that you're gonna let us know that is body or ashes, for the purposes of the funeral. And you will have, as we said last week, you will have made a plan for that with a funeral home or with a cremation service or something like that. Yeah. Now, if you have bought a spot in the memorial garden, we will know from our records that you're planning to be buried there. Yeah. And that would be ashes only, right? That would tell us what we needed to know there. All right? So you've got a list of hymns in front of you, you've got a list of readings in front of you, and you've got that form. I'm gonna start walking around, listening to how things are going. If you have a particular question, just put your hand up or grab my finger as I walk by, and we'll answer those questions particularly.
When it says contact name, who are you referencing? Somebody?
Thank you. Contact name is the person that at this moment you think we should be in contact with to work this funeral plan. So it's just your closest contact. It can be, but doesn't have to be a close family member. It's the person that, and you'll probably want to have checked this out with them in advance, but it's the person that when we hear that you have died, if we have not heard directly from a family member yet, we're going to reach out to this person and say, we've got this plan on file. Let's start talking about dates and so forth.
Is that name and phone number?
Name, phone number, and email if you haven't